Today we'll be talking about the arts of Islam in the later period after around 1500 or so. By this point, many of the arts of Islam had already taken on the forms we associate with them today, and in many cases were highly evolved and highly sophisticated. One example of this is architecture. The architecture, particularly of mosques in the Islamic world, had already settled into highly elaborate forms by the 1500s, and many of the mosques we see built in this period after 1500 are incredibly decorative and incredibly elaborate. These mosques do show the basic elements of mosque architecture. They usually have 4 minarets or towers on each corner, which call the faithful to prayer. They have a mihrab, or a niche that points in the direction of Mecca, that's designed to show the direction of prayer. And frequently they use arch and dome construction. If you took World Art 1, you might have talked about the relationship of some of these forms to earlier Byzantine and Roman forms as they develop and evolve in similar geographic locations in the Middle East. This particular example, the Mosque of Selim II in Turkey, is considered to be one of the finest examples from the period after 1500. It's incredibly decorative and incredibly elaborate, and it also shows us somewhat unusual features. We can see in the top right corner the square speakers platform, and it's a little bit hard to get a sense in just still pictures, but that element is actually centered underneath the round dome. Art historians have various theories for why this might be true, including theories that this evokes the feeling of sacred geometry with the square centered inside the circle, and also that it may have borrowed from Christian churches by creating a prominent platform in the center of the mosque. We can also see, even if only in bits in these photos, the elaborate decorations of the mosque. In religious art and religious architecture, Islamic art avoids figural representation. Islamic art specifically forbids the depiction of religious figures as human figures or human images. Instead, if religious figures such as Allah or Muhammad are depicted, they're depicted as symbols or signs. And the result of that is much of the decoration, especially of religious architecture, is what's in English called an arabesque. An arabesque is a floral or geometric design, and these kinds of floral or geometric designs are widely used in both earlier and later Islamic art. However, like other religions, Islam spreads over a wide region by the end of the 15th century, and in some cases even earlier, and we see wide varieties in the types of architecture that are created under the label of quote-unquote Islamic architecture. This example from the modern country of Mali shows a combination of native architectural building materials and architectural styles with the need to have a large, or the desire to have a large religious building. This particular mosque is now widely regarded as an architectural wonder of the world, but its history is much more checkered. We think that an original building that may or may not have looked somewhat like this was built originally in the 13th century, probably when Islam first comes to North Africa. This was described only once in the Western literary tradition by a French explorer who was dismissive, at best, we might say, of the building. He talked about how it was abandoned and swallows used it for their nests and it smelled very bad. So, needless to say, probably not the most culturally sensitive description. And the building itself was demolished by French colonial authorities. However, in 1907, the building was rebuilt again by French colonial authorities. This rebuilding was somewhat problematic, as they did use coercive and forced labor practices to rebuild the building. But today, the Great Mosque at Jen is a community-supported endeavor. This adobe style of building, made out of mud and straw, needs to be rebuilt or patched and repaired where it has worn away because of weather and time. And the whole community comes together once a year to have a grand ceremony or a grand ritual where that rebuilding takes place over a couple of weeks. Another Islamic example of architecture that takes us to India, the next place we're going to go, is the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal is really famous to us as a more secular building. We think of it as a monument to love. This was built by the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan as a mausoleum or a monument to his favorite wife, Mumtaz Mahal, after she dies in childbirth. But in the construction of this building, we really see many of the elements of Islamic architecture being used. The Mughal dynasty in northern India was an Islamic dynasty, and while their styles of art mixed with native styles of India, there's a clear, strong Islamic influence here. We can see the 4 minarets on the outside corners of the Taj Mahal, and this onion dome shape that we see on the center building, again, has its references or has its origins in the Middle East. We also see in the pointed arches other elements of Islamic architecture, and if we look at close-up pictures of this building, there's an elaborate white-on-white inlay pattern that covers nearly the whole surface of the building. And that also draws inspiration from Islamic design elements. There are many arabesque type patterns, those kinds of floral or geometric patterns that we talked about in the Mosque of Selim II. And even in these far distant locations, we see similar ideas and influences.